Hello and welcome. I'm Alan Gerstal.
And I'm Laurel Sauer. Thanks for joining us for Heritage. It's a series of unique award-winning programs originally produced by WXEL's partners at the Education Network.
Tonight we begin a two-part look at the Holocaust. As the producer, I chose to call it The Holocaust What If, because I want viewers to put themselves into the shoes of the millions of Jews and other minorities who suffered and died under Nazi oppression. I want you viewers to ask yourself, what if this happened to me? How would I manage to cope?
Now, Alan, we are so fortunate to actually live in a democracy where people of different races and religions can work and play side by side. But back in Germany in the 1930s and 40s, Germany deviated from those freedoms that we actually take for granted. People who were different, whether they be Jews, Jehovah's Witnesses, gypsies, or homosexuals, were all persecuted and killed precisely because they were different.
The Nazis developed what they called the final solution for Jews and other minorities. Now, at first, they would be shot and their bodies would be dumped into mass graves, but that wasn't efficient enough for Adolf Hitler and his minions. Their plans for wiping out entire populations meant they had to create a method of extermination on a grand scale. And they did. They developed gas chambers where many dozens of people could be put to death at one time. And throwing every last vestige of humanity to the wind, the Nazis would force prisoners to remove the dead bodies to make way for the next round of the condemned.
Now, because the subject matter and because some of this video is very disturbing, we want to caution parents that this program may not be appropriate for your younger children. But the story is certainly a lesson in history that resonates with everyone old enough to grasp the horrors wrought by Nazi Germany.
The original program was too long to show in a half-hour time frame, so we are extending it over 2 evenings, the second part coming up next week. We begin tonight with Norman Frajman. Norman lives in Palm Beach County, but he was born in Warsaw, Poland in 1929. Here's his story of survival as we begin the Holocaust. What if?
What if all your freedoms were revoked, your friends turned on you, and you were condemned to a life of fear?
And of course, any smallest infraction of any law was immediately punishable by death, no questions asked.
What if part of your city was walled in, and you were forced to live within those ghetto walls, in cramped housing with very little food?
People were standing in the street, literally begging, and there was nothing to give them. There were mothers cradling children, protecting them from the cold, and these children were not alive anymore. They did not want to part with them.
What if you were suddenly forbidden to go to school because of your race or religion?
I came to school, to my classroom. Teacher was standing at the door, waiting for me. Suddenly started shouting, translated like, "You dirty, filthy Jew, you pig," spit at me, closed the door.
What if you were forcefully separated from your parents, never to see them again?
In the morning, all hell broke loose. Selection. First, they took away children from mothers, number one. Then they separated men from women.
What if a family hid you as a child from people who wanted to kill you? What would have happened if you'd been discovered?
They would have shot them. They would have shot them, the whole family. What they did was unbelievable. I sometimes ask myself, what would I do? If the tables were turned, would I take such a chance?
The city of Warsaw is the capital of Poland. Before the beginning of World War II, Warsaw was a dynamic metropolis and a major center of Jewish life in Poland. More than 350,000 people, 30% of that city's population were Jewish. Norman Frajman was born in Warsaw in 1929.
And life was perfectly normal and excellent up till the beginning of the war, which was September 1, 1939. Prior to this, I had a normal childhood. My parents were business people. We never lacked for anything. My immediate family consisted of mom, dad, my sister who was 18 months younger than I, myself, plus we were really surrounded by relatives.
The good life ended, though, when Germany attacked Poland and overran the country in 2 short weeks.
The city of Warsaw was bombed without mercy, and the government of Poland advised us, the citizens of Warsaw, to evacuate the city, and they advised us to go towards the Russian border, which is the eastern part of Poland.
So the family took a horse and wagon and left. Stopping in a small town near Bialystok, they tried to establish a new life. After some time, though, other refugees told them the Germans were occupying Warsaw, but life remained quite normal. So the family decided to return to their home.
We arrived in Warsaw and go into an apartment. It's plundered, it's bare, but a lot of strange people living there. So upon persuasion, they allowed us to take one of our rooms.
Just one room in the apartment the family had formerly owned.
Oh, we settled in, and I went downstairs to play with my friends. Most of them were non-Jewish. We grew up at the same time, and their parents, our parents, their parents were friends. Some of them were employed by my dad. But suddenly I became the proverbial Jew boy to them.
His former friends bullied him and beat him repeatedly. The friends who had grown up together were no longer friends, because one of them was Jewish.
Life was fairly normal up until, I would say, the fall of 1940, when the Germans decided that they are going to create a ghetto in Warsaw. And like overnight, they hung out posters and that we have to leave where we are into a designated area, and that would hold approximately 125,000 people.
But the population of the Warsaw Ghetto swelled to more than 400,000. 400,000 people crammed into a walled-in neighborhood that was a little more than 1 square mile. A typhus epidemic swept through the ghetto, and the food rations were barely enough to sustain human life. Between 1940 and 1942, an estimated 83,000 Jews died from disease and from starvation.
And people were standing in the street literally begging, and there was nothing to give them. You could see faces there that were swollen from starvation. They were yellow in pallor, swollen bellies. There were mothers cradling children, protecting them from the cold, and these children were not alive anymore. They did not want to part with them.
Many people sold any meager possessions they had hidden from the Nazis to buy food for their families. Life, as survivors recall it, was a hellish place of horror.
There were a lot of Schindlers in the Warsaw Ghetto. They came to create industries because labor was cheap. All they did, they didn't pay us. They paid it to the Germans, to the SS, who in turn had slaves. They had a whole pool of free labor. All they had to do was give us a slice of bread, and we were good for the day to manufacture. Germans, they had a favorite game. They would run to the ghetto on a motorcycle with a mounted machine gun on it and a sidecar, and shoot indiscriminately into the populace, knowing full well whoever they will hit is going to be a Jewish person.
The Nazis, he says, were experts in breaking people's spirits. That's one reason nobody fought back. They were demoralized as well as outnumbered. In early 1943, though, groups of young people resisted for 6 weeks before being overwhelmed by German troops. But Norman and many thousands of others were forced out of the ghetto before that uprising and packed 120 at a time into cattle cars.
For the journey, we got 2 buckets, 1 5-gallon buckets of water for 120 people, and 1 5-gallon bucket to relieve yourself. Anybody who sweated in that wagon, somebody reached over and wiped the sweat of their faces to moisten their lips.
They endured a 4-day stop-and-go journey from Warsaw to the infamous Majdanek concentration camp. During the journey, 12 people suffocated in his railroad car. When they arrived, they were marched into an open field surrounded by barbed wire and towers.
First, they took away children from mothers, number 1. Then they separated men from women. Then you had to go by a German who, with the motion of his hand, of his thumb, directed you to the left or to the right. And people who didn't walk straight, people who wore glasses, people with gray hair, anybody who was not a perfect specimen for slavery, they put them aside, put them away in the lorry, never to be seen again. And this was the last time that I did see my mother and sister alive.
Being a teenager who was fit for work, though, Norman survived. There were hundreds of concentration camps, but only 6 killing factories, all located in Poland. Majdanek was one of them.
This was a concentration camp that whenever a transport arrived, and a transport consisted maybe of 5,000 people at one shot, they took you directly to the gas chambers. They left maybe 100 people to clean up the mess. People were killed, gassed, and then they killed 100 people. We were immediately dehumanized. I stopped having a name as of then. I was strictly known by a number. You know, the clothing, the large got a small size, the small got a large size.
The prisoners labored at non-essential chores all day and existed on a near-starvation diet. Food was so scarce that many people ate the grass under their feet. And the evenings brought little relief. They slept in bunks stacked 3 high. Each bunk had a blanket that was infected with lice, and everyone wanted the upper bunk.
Why everybody wants the top? Because by eating grass, people came down with diarrhea and dysentery. And this stuff trickled down because we slept on slots, plus that little straw on it. The place was just, life was absolutely nil.
And escape was not an option. Watchtowers, an electric fence, and landmines around the perimeter saw to that. Punishment for even minor violations meant death in the gas chambers or on the gallows.
I've been under the Germans for 5 years. I've seen all different kinds of deaths, just about everything that's in existence to kill a person. But this stands out in my mind because as they were giving out their last breath already, their tongues were hanging out. They put mirrors in front of their faces to watch themselves die. There was also a case of a father and son. The father was also cited for a very minor infraction, but immediately they sentenced you to die. So we had to watch this execution also. What was different about this, that his 14-year-old son had to hold the father's hand for 24 hours while the father was hanging.
Norman was transferred from Majdanek to another concentration camp in 1943, along with thousands of others. On November 3, 1943, there were almost 18,000 Jewish people left at Majdanek.
And on that date, they brought loudspeakers and played beautiful music, and they machine gunned almost 18,000 people to death in one day, calling it a harvest day.
He wound up working in an ammunitions factory where conditions were as miserable as in the other camps.
But there in that camp, I came down with typhus, and I was selected to die because I was non-productive. And I was rescued by one of my very close friends who was a carpenter. He literally plucked me out of the line of the condemned and brought me to his shop and hid me behind some wood shavings, thereby saving my life.
Somehow, Norman survived his sickness and went back to work. With the Allied troops closing in, though, he was once again evacuated, and this time sent to Buchenwald, a camp deep inside Germany, where he assembled bazookas. That's where he was given the jacket to wear that he still retains today.
From there, we've heard artillery. We already heard that the Allies, we saw hundreds, literally hundreds of planes flying over us. Remember, we're not too far from Dresden, and one day you couldn't see the sun. That's how many airplanes there were. And they just destroyed the city in no time at all, just pulverized it.
It was mid-April 1945 when the Nazis evacuated the camp and sent the prisoners on a death march. They walked until May 7, 1945, when they were put up in a school for the night.
In the morning, we get up, there's a tank in front of school. I said, okay, this is the end of us. They're probably going to do away with us because they want to cover up the atrocities, and that's it. But the turret opens up and out comes a Russian officer. And that was the day of my liberation. I attribute that sometimes to Providence, that I was meant to stay alive. There's no other explanation, because nothing that I could do possibly would prevent them from killing me. It was just, we have a word called Bashert, which means it's meant to be. And that probably was my destination.
How does Norman feel about the so-called revisionists, the deniers who claim the Holocaust never really happened?
This is part of my calling, to call them a liar. As long as I am a living witness, nobody can deny this. Nobody can deny this.
In 1945, at the end of the war, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander, anticipated the deniers. He wrote, "The same day I saw my first horror camp. I have never been able to describe my emotional reactions when I first came face to face with the indisputable evidence of Nazi brutality and ruthless disregard for every shred of decency. I made the visit deliberately in order to be in a position to give first-hand evidence of these things, if ever in the future there develops a tendency to charge these allegations merely to propaganda."
I have the most wonderful credentials for hatred. I earned the right to hate. But my answer is no, I do not hate. I dislike them immensely. To me, they're lower than a snake's belly. But I cannot utter that word of hate, because this is what brought this whole tragedy on. And if I become a hater, Hitler would have succeeded in making a hater out of me. And I simply am not going to permit him.
What an incredible story, Alan. It's hard to believe that anyone could have gone through what Norman actually did and then be able to talk about it in such an articulate way.
I can't tell you how many times I've listened to what Norman has to say, and I can't tell you how many times I have marveled at his emotional response. Despite all that was done to him, Norman cannot hate. Hitler would be the winner if he turned Norman into a hater, so Norman simply is not going to permit him.
Now, we can all learn an important lesson here, Alan. I guess that's what you were hoping for as you put together Norman's story. So what other stories are coming up next?
Well, I think we all know the story of Anne Frank, Laurel, but she was certainly not the only hidden child. We'll meet a woman who was hidden by a family on a farm in France during the war.
We all knew what was going on. As little as we were, we realized what was going on. My life went on on the farm. They were very, very good to me. I call the daughters my sisters of the dark days. One day, Odile, the youngest, she saw a truck stop at the end of the path with Germans coming out of it with guns. And immediately they took me, the farmers took me, put me in the next room under the mattress. And at that time, the old beds had these big springs, so that I was face down on the springs and the mattress on top of me. And they looked around the farm and took food. You know, it was a farm, so they took all kinds of food and left. Again, I was lucky. Second time, I saw them. And I ran in and told Madame Martin. And this time, she had Odile go with me on top of the barn where they kept the feed for the cows and hid me under the feed. Again, the same thing.
The family kept her hidden throughout the rest of the war. Her mother never managed to visit her again at the farm, but Rosette was protected by the Martin family until the war was over.
That's just a small part of Rosette Goldstein's story, and it's another story that's difficult for us to fully grasp. What would we do under those circumstances, and would we have the courage and fortitude to forge on when faced with those dire circumstances?
Then there's also the story of Liesl Bogart. She grew up in Czechoslovakia and counted 43 people in her family before the Nazis invaded that country. After World War II, though, she was the only survivor. And she was a first-hand witness to the Nazis' greatest public relations campaign of the war.
The Nazis were masters of propaganda. They developed a plan to convince the world that the stories about their atrocities were not true. They would create a make-believe village and invite the International Red Cross to inspect it.
They picked our camp for the reason that before the war, Terezin was a lovely little village. It had a village green, it had a church in back with a clock tower. It was a garrison town. Of course, the people were moved out and it was turned into a concentration camp. So they decided one block of barracks around that village green would lend itself beautifully to create that village.
But Terezin was so overcrowded, the Nazis transported as many as 40,000 prisoners to other camps, so the streets wouldn't look like wall-to-wall people.
They selected 360 younger people, I was one of them, and 600 what they called extras. And we were ordered now to create this village. The barracks were painted, storefronts were created, everything and everything you can picture in a little village, from a grocery store, a bakery, a sewing room, doctor's office, schoolroom, prayer room, entertainment room, coffee shop, a dance hall, a music, everything and everything, including a bank.
They even went so far as to print fake money to be used at the bank.
And we had rehearsals and dress rehearsals. And the extras were used for, boys had to play like a soccer team, extras were used for cheering, people had to go to the bank, some had to go to school, some had to sit in a coffee shop. And then the Red Cross came, and about a day and a half, 2 days later, the Red Cross left. During the time they were there, well rehearsed ahead of time, one of the assessment went to the sandbox. tousled little Johnny's hair, who had to play there with other children, and said, "Would you like another cookie or lollipop or a sardine?" And little Johnny had to say, "No, thank you," pulling out of his pocket some more candies. I already had enough today's sweets.
Once the Red Cross left, the order came to dismantle the phony village. And all the participants in the hoax, some 960 people, were put on the next transport to be gassed.
So how did Liesel survive? You'll see how the Nazis' focus on perfection saved her life on the next Heritage. I'm Alan Gerstal.
And I'm Laurel Sauer. We'll see you next time for part 2 of the Holocaust, What If?